I was having coffee recently with an acquaintance, someone who, considers herself a staunch advocate for women's safety.
Okay.
And a news alert popped up on her phone about a really harsh prison sentence for a violent abuser.
Right.
And her reaction was it was immediate, visceral almost. She leaned back and just said, "Good. Finally, lock him up and throw away the key."
That's a very common reaction, a very understandable one.
Totally. To her, the logic was just airtight. There are bad men, there are cages, and the solution is just to make the cages tighter and the sentences longer. It was a moral victory for her.
A sense of justice being served.
Exactly. But then the whole conversation it hit a wall. I mentioned this one really uncomfortable statistic, that nearly 64% of violent offenders recidivate within 8 years. They often come back to society more violent than when they left.
And that changes the equation completely.
It did. The relief on her face just evaporated. She had no answer for it. For the fact that the very system she was championing, this thing she called justice, wasn't actually stopping the violence.
He was maybe even acting as an incubator for it.
Precisely. It revealed this stunning contradiction. She was cheering for a system designed to end male aggression, that is, by its very nature, the ultimate engine of aggression. It just made me wonder, are we actually solving the crisis of violence, or are we just outsourcing it to a system that guarantees the cycle never, ever ends?
And that right there is the central dilemma we have to unpack for you.
That's huge.
It is, because the emotional appeal of that punitive approach is incredibly strong. We all crave those immediate, satisfying answers like, lock him up and throw away the key.
Of course. It feels like a resolution.
It's a completely natural, visceral cry for safety, for retribution. But, and this is the big but, if our actual goal is genuine, long-term public safety.
If we really want to stop that horrifying 64% recidivism rate.
Exactly. And then we have to look beyond that easy, visceral answer. We have to be willing to question the foundational assumptions that, that underpin both our understanding of male violence and the structure of the justice system itself.
Absolutely. The question isn't whether abusers should be held accountable. I mean, of course they should. It's what form of accountability actually stops the abuse from happening again and again and again.
Yes.
So our deep dive today is really a radical shift in perspective. We're going beyond the bars to look at why we rely on a carceral system, a system built around aggression, domination, control, to fix a crisis of male aggression.
We're going to dismantle the structural drivers of that violence, analyzing exactly why our current reliance on police and prisons fundamentally fails to deliver safety for survivors.
And then the hopeful part.
We'll explore these powerful, evidence-based alternatives that focus entirely on prevention and transformation rather than just on retribution.
It's like we're asking a fundamental question.
Yeah, we are. If violence is a public health crisis that stems from broken social structures, why on earth are we treating it solely as a criminal justice problem?
So let's start at the absolute beginning of this problem, the aggressor.
Right.
When we look at violent crime, we usually default to what sociologists call the bad man theory.
A bad apple theory.
Exactly. The idea that violence is just the result of a few, individually morally corrupt people who need to be isolated from the rest of us.
And if that were true, prison would be the perfect solution.
It would work. But the sheer volume of violence, the predictability of its patterns, it just suggests that explanation is way too thin. Our analysis suggests the root cause is much deeper, that it's embedded in how society actually constructs masculinity itself.
That's right, because if violence were purely an individual failing, just a moral deficiency in a few outliers, then locking up those few bad apples would absolutely work, and our recidivism rate wouldn't be 64%.
It would be close to zero.
It would. But the prevalence, the persistence, the consistency of this violence across all demographics shows that it is structural. We are looking at a system problem, not just an individual one. And the foundational work of thinkers like Michael Kaufman, it challenges this simplistic view by detailing what he calls the construction of masculinity and the triad of men's violence.
The triad.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds like a complicated theoretical model, but the way Kaufman frames it, it's actually a brilliant way to connect dots that usually seem completely disconnected in public discourse. What are the three corners of this self-reinforcing system?
It connects them precisely because violence isn't isolated. It's a closed-loop system, just like you said.
Okay.
So the triad has three essential corners, and they all feed into and reinforce one another. First, you have violence against women.
Right, the one we all recognize immediately. Domestic violence, sexual assault,
The most visible part, yes. Then second, you have violence against other men. And this covers everything from, street fighting and gang violence all the way up to war, and even that ritualized competition you see in some workplaces.
So the power dynamics between men.
Yes. And finally, and this is the one we often miss, violence against oneself.
What does that mean?
It means internalized violence, self-hatred, self-destructive behaviors.
Like substance abuse?
Substance abuse, recklessness, and ultimately suicide. All three are linked.
So if we're only focused on that first corner, on the battering or the rape, we are missing the systemic drivers that fuel the whole engine.
You are.
We can't fully solve violence against women without also understanding why men have such high rates of death by suicide, or why they engage in so many high-risk behaviors. It's all flowing from the same well of internalized stress.
Precisely. And that well is what Kaufman calls the societal feeding ground of violence. Patriarchal, heterosexist, authoritarian, and class-divided societies.
Mouthful.
It is, but think about what's required to maintain those rigid systems of hierarchy.
Constant enforcement.
Constant enforcement and the repression of certain innate human needs and desires. Theorists call it surplus repression.
Surplus repression.
They're forced to suppress more than is natural. And this enforced repression then aggravates other impulses, nurturing what he calls a psychology of violence that shows up in the triad.
So if society is built on domination and control, the people in it learn to use domination and control.
It becomes their primary mode of interaction, especially when the very system we use to solve it, the carceral system, is the ultimate embodiment of that same logic.
This analysis leads us to this fascinating paradox at the heart of the problem.
Yeah.
Masculinity. It's so often associated with ultimate power, right? Strength with domination.
The peak of the hierarchy.
Yet, according to this research, it is terrifyingly fragile. How can the seemingly strongest ideological force in society be so fundamentally unstable?
Because it's an ideology. That's the key. It's a set of performative rules and expectations that you have to constantly prove. It is not a biological certainty.
Okay, so distinguish that for us.
Well, the biological fact of being male is certain. But the masculine ideal, the source material describes it as a figment of our collective patriarchal surplus repressive imaginations.
Wow.
Which means that boys and men are socialized to constantly harbor this profound insecurity about their male credentials.
They're always performing a role.
Always. And always failing to some degree because the role itself is impossible to sustain perfectly.
And you mentioned this psychic construction starts incredibly early. It creates a deep-seated vulnerability from childhood.
Yes, the basis for this lifelong performance of masculinity is often established unconsciously before the age of 6. It's codified as this necessary and really intense rejection of the mother.
The mother. Why the mother?
And by extension, anything associated with femininity. Because the mother represents that first, intense, inescapable relationship of dependence, of powerlessness. To achieve manhood in this model, the boy has to embrace this project of controlling himself and controlling the world. He has to strive for what society deems activity and reject passivity and vulnerability at all costs.
So the core of masculine identity isn't built on self-acceptance or wholeness.
Yeah.
It's built on deep, active suppression. It's about repressing half of the spectrum of normal human emotional experience.
Exactly. To become male in this framework requires what the source calls that surplus repression of passive aims.
And passive aims are?
The desire to be nurtured, to express fear, deep grief, pain, or simply to be emotionally vulnerable and accept that you're dependent on others sometimes.
Things we all feel.
Things we all feel. But because this suppression is constantly required and deeply unnatural, it creates this massive inner tension, this insecurity about one's masculinity. It's the constant unconscious fear of being psychologically castrated or desexed, of being reduced to a state of feminine powerlessness.
And that internal pressure cooker has to have a release valve.
It does. And that inner tension, that perpetual insecurity, then fuels a desperate need for constant external affirmation.
And when that inner pressure needs an outlet, that affirmation takes the form of violence. It becomes a compensatory mechanism, right? It's filling the gap left by all that repression and insecurity.
Absolutely. The tension and insecurity about one's place in the male hierarchy, or the fear of failing to meet the impossibly rigid masculine grade, it propels men into what's called surplus aggression.
Surplus aggression.
Violence in this context isn't necessarily about pleasure. It is a desperate performance. It's designed to deny the internal reality of emotional vulnerability. It's a way of reestablishing that masculine equilibrium, a declaration to oneself and others. I am potent. I have power. I am not weak or passive.
And we see clear illustrations of this when researchers actually interview convicted violent offenders, don't we? The testimonies show that the crime is often about shoring up that fragile sense of self, not just some random impulse.
The testimonies collected by Douglas Jackson are incredibly revealing of this exact mechanism.
What do they say?
Well, consider the words of one rapist, a man named Hal. He admitted, quote, "I felt very inferior to others. I felt rotten about myself, and by committing rape, I took this out on someone I thought was weaker than me, someone I could control."
Someone he could control. It's all about power.
It's all about compensating for a lack of it. Another, Len, saw it as the fullest area to let your anger out on. This isn't just generic criminality. It's a crime that plays out in the specific, distorted language of the sex-gender system.
Where the man, feeling personally denied power or suffering from a negative self-image,
uses force to affirm his masculine credentials. The power fantasy replaces the feeling of inadequacy.
and this sense of being denied power is often tied directly to class and status, right? Which makes violence a kind of class-specific expression of domination.
That's a critical intersectional point here.
So it's not the same for everyone.
Not at all. For a middle-class or wealthy man, that striving for power might be expressed through workaholism, status symbols the size of his paycheck. The domination is economic and symbolic.
Right.
But for a working-class man who feels denied access to that world of business and wealth, who feels systematically oppressed male power, is often defined through direct physical force.
What's called working-class machismo.
Exactly. Manual labor, toughness, physical strength, mastery over one's immediate environment. Even though these things are often stigmatized by society at large, they become the only available embodiment of masculine power for these men.
If you can't master the world of finance, you master domination through physical strength or coercion.
It is a direct mechanism for turning systemic economic shame into direct interpersonal aggression. And that just fuels the violence triad even more.
Let's move to that second corner of the triad you mentioned. Violence against other men. This includes literal fighting and war, obviously, but the analysis argues this violence serves a crucial, often hidden psychological function in defining and defending manhood.
It does. Violence against other men reinforces a very harsh competitive reality, that relations between men are fundamentally relations of power and competition, not automatic solidarity.
And that must create immense, constant anxiety.
It does. Every other man is a potential judge, a rival, a humiliator, someone who can expose your vulnerability and challenge your status.
Which is why you see these complex systems of male bonding, right? Like clubs or highly ritualized sports or military units. They act as these necessary havens where affection and closeness, things that are otherwise socially forbidden, can be expressed.
They're an attempt to mitigate the intense anxiety and isolation created by that male hierarchy, yes. But they can never fully succeed because the rules of competition always remain.
So even within those havens, the tension is still there.
Precisely. And it often manifests as ritualized violence or intense policing of boundaries. Think about the common phenomenon Kaufman describes, that friendly mutual violence among boys.
The slugging greetings, the constant challenging, the relentless teasing and hazing rituals.
Yes. This acts as an active assault to balance the underlying affection and the genuine need for connection with other men.
How so?
Well, according to Freudian analysis, deep social relations between men require a great amount of passivity. The acceptance of being cared for, the act of bonding. But this passivity immediately triggers that profound fear of losing one's power, that echo of castration anxiety.
So the aggression is a counterbalance.
It's necessary counterbalance. It turns the desire for connection into a competition for dominance, all to deny the vulnerability of depending on someone else.
And this is where homophobia enters the equation. And it's not just a random social bias, is it? It's an essential psychological tool for maintaining this whole system of rigid masculinity. It's the enforcement mechanism.
Absolutely. The sources describe homophobia as a socially constructed phobia that is essential for the imposition and maintenance of masculinity. To understand why it's so violent, we have to go back to that rejection of passive aims.
Okay.
The young boy learns the equation. Male equals power equals active equals masculine. The opposite. Feminine equals passive equals weakness.
So anything passive is a threat.
A huge threat. Erotic attraction or deep yielding emotionality towards other men has to be sacrificed and repressed because it's psychologically associated with those forbidden passive feminine aims. The fear of yielding, of submission, of being soft.
So the fear of homosexuality is fundamentally the fear of losing the masculine identity and power that has been so painstakingly constructed through all this repression.
That's the psychic root of it. The anxiety caused by that threat is the motive force behind the social learning of the normal boy. And when this anxiety and successfully repressed desire return, which they inevitably do in highly charged male activities.
Like sports or the military.
Exactly. They get transferred onto homosexuality itself. Homophobia, expressed as hostility, verbal aggression, and physical violence against other men, becomes a critical means to deny that attraction, to discharge this enormous tension, and to police the boundaries of who counts as a man.
It's a way for the system to express and discharge the attraction of men to other men without threatening the whole masculine edifice.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It's a vicious, closed, self-destructive loop. You repress emotion, you feel fragile and anxious, you use violence against others to compensate, and then you use homophobia and aggression to police the boundaries of that fragile identity.
Yeah.
It sounds utterly exhausting and completely unsustainable.
It is exhausting, and this leads us directly back to that third corner, violence against oneself.
The pressure cooker.
The pressure cooker, the continual blocking of core emotions, fear, pain, sadness, the need for care. It turns men into emotional pressure cookers. Since they can't discharge these feelings in a healthy or relational way, those feelings get transformed into anger and hostility.
Directed inward or outward?
Inward as guilt, self-hate, depression, high-risk behavior, suicide. Or outward at the safest, most vulnerable target, often women or children. The entire structure of the masculine ego, built on surplus repression and surplus aggression, is itself an edifice of internalized violence.
So the insight here is really clear. The crisis of external violence, the assault, the battery, the rape, is actually driven by a crisis of internal male pain, shame, insecurity, and repressed emotion.
That's the core of it.
And if that's the deep structural root, then the traditional approach of simply increasing external punishment, the police and prison model, is just fundamentally doomed to fail.
Because it only addresses the symptom of aggression with even more institutional aggression.
That sets the stage perfectly for our critique of the system we currently rely on. We began with that shocking statistic. The vast majority of violent offenders recidivate.
That's 64%.
We have to understand why we keep building more prisons and extending sentences if they're just incubating the very aggression we're trying to stop. And this brings us to a really powerful intellectual and political movement that directly challenges this reliance on cages. Abolition feminism.
Abolition feminism, or AF. It was coined and developed by thinkers and activists like Angela Y. Davis and Bethy Ritchie, and it's a radical branch of feminism. It calls for the elimination of the prison industrial complex, or the PIC.
And it's fundamentally opposed to carceral feminism.
It is. Carceral feminism is that dominant view that relies on police, prisons, and stricter laws as the primary and sometimes the only solution for gender-based violence. AF demands that we recognize the systemic roots of violence, both state violence and interpersonal violence.
So AF's core argument is that you can't fix a deep structural problem like male violence rooted in patriarchy and repression with an individual punitive measure managed by a state institution that is itself fundamentally oppressive.
Precisely. AF insists that violence is a structural issue. It's built on layers of patriarchy, racism, and classism, and therefore it requires structural solutions that go beyond imprisonment. You can't solve a deep social problem by outsourcing it to an institution, the prison system, that is itself built on those same intersecting structures of oppression.
The prison is a perfect example of institutionalized domination.
It is. So AF proponents argue that feminism and abolition have to inform one another to provide a comprehensive critique of this entire system.
The numbers you cited earlier on the growth of the U.S. prison population are just staggering. From 270,000 in 1975 to 2 million in 2001. How does that explosive growth relate directly to the system's failure to stop gender-based violence?
It relates tragically. That exponential growth was driven by policies like mandatory minimums, the war on drugs, tough on crime legislation, and it disproportionately impacted men of color. Over 90% of those prisoners are men, and about 50% are black men.
Okay, so that's one side of the ledger.
Now look at the other side. Despite that astronomical increase in incarceration, despite locking up millions of men, The rates of reported violent crimes against women have remained relatively constant since 1973.
Wait, say that again? They remain constant.
Relatively constant. This is the ultimate contradiction that AF exposes. Mass incarceration did not correlate with increased safety for women. It only correlated with increased policing and punishment for marginalized communities.
What's fascinating here is that this critique of the carceral state wasn't easy for the anti-violence movement to adopt. It actually required a political confrontation, didn't it? It led to the 2001 Critical Resistance Insight, Statement on Gender Violence and the Prison Industrial Complex. Can you explain the conflict that made that statement necessary?
Well, the problem was a fundamental rift in focus and political vision. The anti-violence movement, understandably desperate for resources and legal leverage for survivors, became deeply entangled with the state.
They started relying on police and prisons for protection and for funding.
They did. And in doing so, they often neglected the issues of systemic state violence, racism, and mass incarceration. Meanwhile, you had the mainstream anti-prison movement.
Which was focused on what?
They often centered men of color as the primary victims of state violence, but they often failed to center the pervasive problem of sexual and domestic violence within those same communities. They weren't adequately addressing the needs of survivors of gender-based violence.
So both movements were operating in contradiction. They were failing to see the complete picture of violence, the violence that comes from the state, and the violence that comes from individuals within the community. They were siloed.
Exactly. And the most heartbreaking part of this political failure is who got marginalized in the process.
Who was that?
Women of color, trans, two-spirit, gender nonconforming, and queer people of color. These are individuals who experience both interpersonal violence and state violence simultaneously. For them, just call the police is not a solution.
It can be an introduction to another form of violence, or even deportation.
Exactly. They needed a unified politic that addressed both threats at the same time. But the movements often had this narrow, normative victim or prisoner in mind.
What do you mean by normative?
Well, for the anti-violence movement, the normative survivor was often conceptualized as a white, heterosexual, middle-class woman who had no prior experience with violent policing or criminalized activity.
And for the prison abolition movement?
The normative prisoner was often seen as a heterosexual man of color who didn't necessarily experience community violence on the outside. This dual failure neglected how the intersections of white supremacy, gender-based oppression, and class define the mutual reinforcement of gender violence and incarceration for marginalized communities.
So the CR Insight statement was a tool to bridge that rift.
A vital organizing tool. It was meant to forge an integrated politic that recognizes violence in all its forms, whether it wears a uniform or lives next door.
Let's pivot to the concrete, proven failures of relying on this punitive model. If safety is the goal, the sources say the carceral system actively undermines it in 4 specific, devastating ways for survivors and the community.
We have substantial evidence proving this. The first failure is just decreased safety.
How can that be? It seems so counterintuitive.
Well, laws demanding harsh sentences and increased arrests, like mandatory arrest laws, were implemented across the country to protect women. But they have not correlated with a decrease in batterers killing their partners.
So they just didn't work.
Not only did they not work, they often result in the arrest of the battered woman, especially women of color who might be reacting to violence or using self-defense.
The system penalizes them for trying to protect themselves.
Yes, dual arrest policies fail to account for the context of abuse, which reduces a person's willingness to call for help in the first place. It can end up protecting the batterer more than the victim. And for undocumented women, sometimes reporting violence gets them referred to immigration authorities instead of protected. It's a shocking example of the state turning an appeal for help into further victimization.
The system also creates an atmosphere of internalized violence, particularly for the growing number of women behind bars who are disproportionately survivors of prior violence themselves.
This is a profound ethical and social failure. The rate of women's imprisonment has skyrocketed since 1970, especially for women of color.
And prisons are, by their design, institutions of violence.
They are the perfect embodiment of power over. They inflict further violence on incarcerated women's sexual, physical, and psychological abuse. You're talking slashing, rape by guards, medical neglect, strip searches.
It's horrific.
An Amnesty International investigation of U.S. women's prisons documented cases where women were treated as a private harem to sexually abuse and harass. sometimes kept in restraints while seriously ill or in labor.
And anti-violence activists have often missed this.
By focusing almost entirely on perpetrator incarceration, they have too often ignored the plight of women prisoners and victims of state violence. The cage itself is a site of gender-based violence.
That structural violence must be incredibly disempowering for survivors who try to use the system for help. Which brings us to the third failure, disempowerment.
Precisely. The adversarial justice system is traumatic. It's often re-traumatizing for survivors. By promoting this individualistic, state-centered approach, the idea that the only way to intervene is to just call the police, it shifts agency and power away from women's ability to organize collectively.
It vests all the power in the state.
A state which has repeatedly demonstrated its inability or unwillingness to protect marginalized women. It isolates the anti-violence movement from its community organizing, social justice roots, and reduces collective power down to an individual, often terrifying police report.
And finally, the punitive system drains the lifeblood out of community support. It ensures the structural issues that lead to violence in the first place, poverty, housing insecurity, lack of mental health care, they never get addressed.
It's a huge resource drain, funneling billions of dollars into policing, courts, and the PIC and industry literally built on failure, inevitably leads to devastating cuts in crucial social programs.
Like women's shelters, public housing, welfare.
All of it. These cutbacks leave women, especially those who are economically dependent on an abusive partner, less able to escape violent relationships.
So it's a self-perpetuating cycle.
Absolutely. The system ensures women remain vulnerable by cutting resources, then it profits by incarcerating the perpetrators without ever addressing the economic and social roots of the violence. It locks people in and it locks help out.
The critique is devastating. An unjust system built on racism and classism, which fails to reduce violence, traumatizes survivors, and actively strips away the resources they need to gain independence. It just begs the question, if the carceral approach fails so completely to create safety, what is the alternative path? Okay, so if punishment fails, the alternative has to be prevention and transformation. We have to address the root cause, that fragile masculinity and systemic repression, not just the resulting crime. Our sources point towards something called gender transformative programming, or GTP, which views violence prevention not as a police matter, but as a public health strategy. It intervenes directly at the root of that constructed masculinity we identified earlier.
GTP is a profound shift. It's defined by actively targeting harmful stereotypes and norms, encouraging critical analysis of gender roles, building skills to question rigid masculinity, and challenging harmful behaviors like homophobia and gender-based harassment.
So it's moving the focus entirely from blaming the individual to transforming the cultural systems that produce the violence in the first place.
Exactly. It uses what's called an ecological approach, so it targets change simultaneously at the individual level, the interpersonal level, family and friends, the sociocultural level of community norms, and the structural level of laws and institutions.
All at once.
All at once.
What are some examples of these approaches in action internationally? You mentioned a key model developed in Latin America that has proven successful all over the world.
A key global model, and one that's been rigorously evaluated across dozens of countries, is Program H. The H stands for homem, which is the Portuguese word for man.
Rome-H.
It was originally developed, tested, and evaluated in Brazil and Mexico by the NGO Promundo, and it's since been implemented across 25 countries. It provides a highly effective blueprint for effective, non-punitive intervention aimed at changing norms.
So tell us about the methodology of Program H. How do they actually transform these ingrained patriarchal norms and years of surplus repression in what is a relatively short period of time? It seems like trying to stop a battleship with a paddle.
It relies on sustained, deep community engagement. The centerpiece is group discussion, conducted over several structured sessions, and it's led by trained community facilitators who actually model gender equitable behavior.
So it's not a top-down lecture.
Not at all. The methodology relies heavily on conscientization. It's a powerful term borrowed from the educator Paulo Freire. It's the capacity for individuals to reflect critically on the history of cultural conditions and class structures that frame gender inequality.
So it's a deep awakening process. It's about moving men from seeing their behavior as just natural to seeing it as socially constructed.
Exactly. It's not about being lectured or simply told violence is bad. It's about creating a safe space for critical reflection on one's own lived experience of manhood.
And forcing them to identify the heavy costs that rigid manhood imposes on them.
Yes. The loneliness, the inability to connect, that emotional pressure cooker effect we talked about.
So they see a personal benefit in changing.
The young men discuss how they are socialized, the emotional costs of rigid manhood, and the real-world benefits of becoming more gender equitable, like better relationships with partners and children.
And in that safe space, the ones who already reject traditional dominance can become role models.
They do. Those youth who already act as voices of resistance become leaders, and they drive social change campaigns in their own communities. For example, youth in the Western Balkans developed a social media campaign called Budi Mushuko, or Be a Man, and it was all centered around reinforcing the workshop messages of connection and care.
And the data shows this actually works. This is crucial when you contrast it with that 64% failure rate of the punitive model.
Yeah.
What are the key health and violence results?
The data is compelling. In the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, young men participating in Program H reported significantly decreased SPI symptoms, a near one-third drop.
Wow.
It demonstrates a tangible link between adopting equitable norms and healthier, safer sexual behavior. In India, participants were 2 to 3 times more likely to use a condom.
And what about violence itself?
Most significantly for our discussion, in a randomized controlled trial in Ethiopia, the proportion of young men who reported using physical violence against a female partner dropped significantly. It went from 36% down to 16%.
Wait, from 36% to 16%? That's a 55% reduction in violence perpetration. That is a profound transformation of behavior achieved through consciousness and community support.
It's something prisons demonstrably fail to achieve, and in fact, often reverse. That level of reduction is impossible to ignore. And the U.S. adaptation, called Manhood 2.0, proves that these concepts are feasible even in complex urban environments, and it specifically targets those intersectional issues of race and class in the U.S.
So how was Manhood 2.0 adapted to address the specific lived realities of young black men in the U.S., where violence is tied not just to gender but to systemic oppression and feelings of external powerlessness?
Manhood 2.0 focused on African American youth in lower resource urban neighborhoods, specifically in Pittsburgh. The adaptation took an asset-based community development approach. They worked with trusted community facilitators, not traditional school teachers, who might be viewed with suspicion.
That was embedded in the community.
It was. They often implemented the program in community centers or as alternatives to suspension or for juvenile justice-involved youth. And they integrated a deep level of intersectionality, meaning a critical and complex exploration of racism, marginalization, and white privilege right alongside male privilege. They added critical analysis of social media and pornography and developed age-appropriate bystander intervention skills tailored specifically to that urban environment.
So they recognized that the feelings of powerlessness tied to systemic racism often manifest as that surplus aggression we discussed?
Exactly. So the curriculum provided emotional and relational tools to respond constructively rather than violently.
So instead of blaming the individual for his violence, they focused on the structural pressures, including systemic racism and poverty, that contribute to his feelings of powerlessness and insecurity, and then gave him the tools to respond constructively.
Precisely. They addressed the core issue. Working in neighborhoods struggling with systemic racism and poverty requires programs that acknowledge trauma and provide real support and agency. And the feasibility demonstrated by the randomized controlled trial operating outside traditional rigid settings and with support from the juvenile justice community, it shows these transformative non-carceral approaches can be implemented successfully. They offer a real alternative to the punitive pipeline.
So Program H and Manhood 2.0 focus on individual and community change. But to achieve truly systemic safety, we have to transform the institutions that structure society. Men still hold, 73% of national parliament seats globally, and they dominate senior management.
Right.
UN Women developed the Transforming Patriarchal Masculinities framework, the TPM framework, to address this bigger picture. It's aiming for deep institutional shifts.
The TPM framework calls for deep and lasting changes in patriarchal institutions and the ideologies that keep them in place. It acknowledges that merely changing individual attitudes isn't enough. We need systemic change in how power operates inside the workplace, the government, and in traditional institutions.
So let's break down the lessons learned from the D-Riles initiative, the dialogue, reflection, insight, learning, and sharing process, which focused on implementing this framework globally.
Okay, so first, we have to improve the group work and connect with men's actual needs.
We've seen that engagement is key. What are the most effective entry points globally to call men in to this kind of institutional transformation without them becoming immediately defensive?
Fatherhood and caregiving are consistently identified as highly effective entry points.
Why is that?
because they leverage a genuine, often repressed desire many men have for deeper connection. Research, including studies in the MENA region, shows that about 50% of men want to spend more time with their children, and they overwhelmingly support paternity leave.
So you can use that desire as a starting point.
Well, exactly. Programs like the Fathers Clubs in Moldova leverage this desire to actively engage men in child rearing and domestic tasks, which fundamentally challenges the gendered division of household labor that harms women and isolates men.
So the entry point is leveraging a genuine desire men have to be better fathers and more present partners, which also happens to challenge rigid gender roles and the repression of those passive nurturing aims we discussed. It offers a benefit to the man while dismantling the system.
Exactly. And that ties into a crucial tactical lesson. The curricula have to use intersectional analysis and give attention to men's perceptions of failed masculinities. Instead of focusing only on the harm men cause, we have to focus on the emotional costs of patriarchy that men themselves experience.
The loneliness, the isolation, the constant performance.
Yes, this shifts the focus from simple blame to transformation based on mutual needs and self-interest. If men see that they are also oppressed by the demands of the system, they are much more willing to dismantle it.
This approach helps men shed that psychic armor of manhood that leads to violence, making them more resilient and capable of nonviolent communication.
Precisely. It builds skills not just in nonviolent communication, but in emotional management and peer support. It reduces the very internal triggers that lead them to use surplus aggression for validation.
Okay, so transforming individuals is one thing, but transforming institutions, the parliaments, the corporations, the religious bodies, that's much harder, especially since men hold the vast majority of power. How does the TPM framework tackle these entrenched power structures?
It focuses on two core strategies for institutional change. The first is challenging paternalism. We have to move beyond framing men's support for women's leadership as men helping or granting women access to power.
It has to be framed as a matter of rights.
Strictly as a matter of rights. It challenges the assumption that power and authority are inherently masculine. Leaders have to publicly promote power with, which is inclusion, shared decision-making, collaboration over power over, which is domination and exclusion. This legitimizes women's authority not as an exception, but as the standard way of operating.
That shift from allyship as charity to allyship as a rights-based commitment seems crucial for institutional legitimacy and lasting change. What's the second strategy for tackling people in power to make sure their commitments aren't just empty words?
Building pressure and accountability. Persuasion alone, just showing powerful men the data, it's insufficient, especially for those entrenched in power.
So you have to apply pressure.
Strategies must involve pressure, both horizontal from peers and vertical from affected constituencies. This means using robust mechanisms like gender audits, an internationally recognized tool, to publicly expose the gap between an institution's public commitment to gender equality and the actual patriarchal culture and practice within that organization.
Visibility is a form of pressure.
It is. We see the strategic use of data as a pressure lever. For instance, UN Women ROAS conducted a survey showing that 70% of the decision makers they surveyed supported the idea of paternity leave.
And when you publicize that,
it exerts enormous internal pressure on institutions to implement it. It shows there is internal demand for change, not just external pressure from activists. Furthermore, the TPM framework strongly recommends developing strict accountability frameworks, for instance, for religious and traditional leaders, to monitor their follow-through on gender-based violence commitments. It forces them to move from abstract words to concrete, measurable action that their communities can actually track.
Our final pillar of transformation is ideology, which reinforces that triad of violence through cultural narratives and media representation. You think of the constant stream of advertising that defines power as male aggression and female bodies as passive objects. How do non-carceral community-based solutions tackle this?
This is tackled by creating community-level accountability to challenge the representations that normalize violence. A brilliant example comes from Ecuador, with Foundation Gamma's work on the Citizen Observatory of Communication, or COC.
And what do they do?
The COC's aim is to change stereotypical and patriarchal representations of femininity and masculinity, especially in advertising and popular media.
So the community itself becomes the critique mechanism. This avoids the need for state censorship or legal intervention, which could be seen as its own form of power over.
Yes. Community members strengthen their media literacy and gender consciousness by sharing and discussing gender analyses of advertising content. The COC convenes these communication halls where the community agrees on rewards for progressive content and sanctions, which are recommendations for amendment or organized boycotts for patriarchal content.
That's a brilliant exercise of grassroots collective power. It's influencing male-dominated media institutions and forcing them to be accountable to the people they serve. It's redefining cultural norms from the ground up.
And the final strategic lesson here emphasizes the importance of a compelling narrative frame, something like the Dare to Care campaign used in the MENA region. This framing has to be consistent. It has to be designed to call men in to transformation based on mutual benefit and self-interest, while also being prepared to use strategic pressure to call men out publicly for misogyny and sexism when necessary.
So it's a combination of persuasion and pressure.
Yes. It's about shifting the entire cultural landscape, the complete opposite of the carceral system, which only provides damaging, ineffective pressure.
We started this deep dive with a moment of visceral relief, that urge to lock up the bad man and solve the problem with an iron fist, trusting the prison system to protect us.
Right.
But what we've uncovered is a painful irony. That solution not only fails spectacularly, resulting in 64% recidivism, but it's built on the very structural violence, racism, classism, repression, domination that it purports to stop.
Indeed. We've seen that male violence is rooted in the socially constructed fragility of masculinity. It's driven by the repression of core human needs and the performance of surplus aggression.
And the carceral system, built on domination and racism and classism, is structurally incapable of healing that root cause.
It operates as a massive resource drain and an incubator for further harm. It actively decreases safety for marginalized survivors and ensures the cycle just repeats.
And the true path to safety is not in making the cages tighter or the punishments harsher. The effective alternatives like Program H, Manhood 2.0, the institutional pressure applied by the TPM framework, they all focus on deep, multi-level transformation.
Challenging fragile masculinity, building emotional resilience, and fostering collective care and accountability in communities and institutions alike.
True safety is achieved when security is not premised on the threat of violence or outsourced to a violent state system.
It is achieved when security is based on a collective commitment to guaranteeing the survival and care of all peoples, fostering environments of radical freedom and passionate reciprocity. This shifts the definition of safety from who is locked up to how well we care for each other.
The crisis of violence against women is not simply a law enforcement problem that can be outsourced to police and prisons. It is a profound societal failure of imagination, demanding a fundamental transformation in how we define, construct, and live out power and manhood itself.